Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, and innovators. My name is Herman Haaland. I'm the managing director of the think tank Skaperkraft, which for the second year in a row is co-hosting this event together with Civita and Oslo Innovation Week. As the leader of a think tank based on Christian values, I believe that it is of fundamental importance to keep and transfer some core values to the next generations of entrepreneurs in order for us to stay competitive. These values were evident in Norway's perhaps most important entrepreneur in the development of our modern society and economy, Hans Nielsen Hauge, who in the early 19th century laid the foundation for the growth of Norway into what our country is today. They include courage, honesty, hard work, and long-term thinking for the gain of greater society. These are vital in order to both stay competitive and increase our innovative capability in the years to come. We in Skaperkraft have the privilege of collaborating with Civita on certain topics where we find common ground, including on this book, Entrepreneurs Build Norway, which, by the way, you can pick up free of charge as you leave today. Today, we are thrilled to welcome you to discuss and compare ourselves to a modern innovation miracle, that of Israel's entrepreneurial model. We would therefore like to thank the Israeli embassy as well for their help in making today's breakfast meeting a reality. As renewable energy inevitably will be more and more important in the years to come, we as a nation increasingly will have to make shifts into new ways of creating economic value. The bottom line is this: we will have to increase our innovation capability. One of the most inspiring books I read on the subject over the past years has been this one, Startup Nation by Dan Senner and Saul Singer. It is therefore my privilege to present our keynote speaker this morning, Saul Singer, who's an American-Israeli journalist and co-author of Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle. He's also former editorial page editor at the Jerusalem Post. Mr. Singer will be joined by Daniel Rasvidal, CEO of the Federation for Norwegian Innovation Companies in Norway, and Anita Krohn-Traaseth, CEO of Innovation Norway. With these words, I would like to hand over the rest of the meeting to one of Civita's fellows, Eirik Løkke, who will guide us through the rest of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. Always a pleasure cooperating with Skaperkraft. In just a few seconds, I will give the floor to Saul Singer. But before I give the floor to Mr. Singer, let me outline the practical details. Saul Singer will speak for about 20 minutes. Thereafter, Daniel Rasvidal and Anita Krohn-Traaseth will give their comments. After the panelists finish their introduction, we will open up for Q&As. Upon taking the floor, we ask you to introduce yourself and speak up, since we do not have a microphone. And I need to emphasize, as always, we're opening up for questions and short comments, not additional speeches. So I ask you to be brief and prescient. I am aware that there are many people sitting in the back. I will notice also you. And if you want to take the floor, please give me a sign and I will register you on the speakers list. And since we do not have a microphone, I will repeat the questions and comments so that everybody here can follow the dialogue. This meeting will finish no later than 9:30, and I kindly ask you to stay seated until then, unless it is absolutely necessary to leave prior to the end of the meeting. Last point, we also urge you to use social media, great innovation, by the way. And the Twitter hashtag for this meeting is CivitaFrokost, but do remember to turn your mobile on a silent mode. So much for the practical details. Mr. Singer, it's an honor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be in Oslo. It's a little bit cooler here than it is in Jerusalem where I live. We're still in t-shirts over there. My kids couldn't believe that it was 3 degrees here, but it's actually quite nice weather. And it's my second time here in Oslo, but I really wish I would have a little time to travel around and see this place. So I want to talk about Startup Nation, but what I really want to do is get into what happened after Startup Nation, after the book, because the book came out about 5 years ago, and Dan and I were hoping that it would do well in the U.S. We were really happy that it became a bestseller there, and we thought we'd spend a couple months speaking about the book, and that would be about the end of it. And then something very surprising happened. Surprising to us. We didn't even think about it. It started getting translated, first in Bulgarian and in Chinese and Italian, French, German, Turkish. It's coming out in Arabic. I got my first email from Mongolia saying we really want to become a startup nation. We want to translate your book. And it's out now in about 27 languages, and there's still a few more coming. And I started traveling, actually. I started following the book around the world. And so instead of 2 months, I've actually been doing this for the last 5 years. And this has been a fascinating education for me about the nature of innovation in the world, and this strange thing that countries all over the world see some relevance to what's going on in Israel. Because, our story is, if you read the book, you'll see, and as you can imagine, a unique story. Our story was about overcoming adversity. We're a tiny country with no resources till recently, in a bad neighborhood. And our story was about overcoming this. In fact, the truth is, even though Norway is about, 20 times in Israel's size, they're actually a small country like us in population. So that's actually, one of the things we talk about as a disadvantage, being from a tiny country. But Israel turned it into an advantage. We're not only tiny, which means we have no local market, but we're cut off from the regional market. So because of that, we had to think globally from day one. So that's, just a small example of turning a disadvantage into an advantage. And I think you'll find, the more I travel, the more I think about these things, that every country has its baskets of strengths and weaknesses, advantages and disadvantages, and often these strengths are also weaknesses, and vice versa. So the example of being a small country is a perfect one. The example of being a rich country is a perfect one. There are advantages to being poor, there are advantages to being rich, and there are disadvantages to each as well. And this is what's going into how every country is basically now trying to build its own innovation ecosystem. So I want to say something, though, about an insight that I think comes from Israel about the nature of innovation. And that is that we have a kind of misconception about innovation. And you can see this because if you put the word innovation into Google Images, you do a search for pictures of innovation, what you'll get is lots of pictures of light bulbs. And that's because the light bulb is the symbol of the idea. And we think of innovation as ideas. And the problem with that is that, innovation is not really ideas. The idea may be one small part of it, but I think that ideas are pretty well distributed around the world. There's really a lot of smart people everywhere. There's a lot of great ideas everywhere. What makes the difference is what does it take to turn an idea into reality, into a startup, into a company, into an innovation. And so the key ends up being what you add to the idea. And I think the Israeli experience shows that there are two big things you have to add to ideas. The first is a lot of drive and determination. And the second is a willingness to take risk. And our story has been, basically the book is when you boil it down, is where did Israel get a little bit more of those two extra ingredients to add to ideas that allowed it to produce more startups than anywhere outside of Silicon Valley. And just to give you an idea, I mean, what a great asset you have here within a direct flight from Oslo. During the summer only, I'm told there's a direct flight from Oslo to Tel Aviv. Maybe we can do something about that. But not only are there more startups in Israel, let's say about 4,000 venture-backed companies in Israel, producing another 1,000 every year. Of course, that doesn't mean it's growing like that. A lot of them are disappearing at the same time. We've got, a few hundred big R&D centers of big companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, IBM, and so on. These R&D centers are, a lot of times they're composed of the startups bought by that company. Like IBM bought, more than 10 companies. Cisco bought more than 10 companies. And that becomes their R&D center. So you get this kind of massive ecosystem there, and it's getting 2.5 times as much venture capital as the United States, about 30 times as much on average, more than Europe. That's probably changing, but roughly speaking. So anyway, so the question is where Israel got more of those two ingredients. And I'll just go very quickly through these things because, but you're going to hear these things, you're going to say, well, that's not Norway. What is it? How does that apply to us? But what I think is so interesting about this story is how everybody needs to do it their own way and can do it their own way. So when I talk about Israel's story, it's not necessarily Norway's story or anybody else's. But our story was about overcoming adversity and where did you get those two extra ingredients? And the first place we got it was that the whole country is a startup. What does that mean? Israel started with an idea. Like, it was one of those ideas. It was a crazy idea. If you're an entrepreneur and you have an idea and you start talking to people about it, everyone's going to tell you it's a crazy idea, guaranteed. Because all good new ideas sound crazy to most people. Otherwise, someone would have done them already. Okay, so that's the first step. So you start with a crazy, impossible idea, and it takes a lot of grit and determination and willingness to take risks to make that idea a reality. So Israel itself is a startup like that. And, our kids, we have 3 kids, 3 girls. Our oldest is 18. So she's now just graduated high school. She's in a kind of gap year, pre-Army gap year program. A lot of her friends are already in the Army, and she's going to be going in about a year. Men for 3 years, women for 2 years. And this has been another huge factor for us, basically culturally, because in Israel, in most places you have 2 stages in life. You have school and you have work. In Israel, you have this third stage in life called the Army, that everybody does, where you learn things that you don't learn in school, you don't learn in work. Things like leadership, teamwork. When you think about, we're talking in the car, and 2 of the people with me both had spent some time on a kibbutz in Israel volunteering, and a lot of actually Norwegians and people from other countries have done this, many years ago. And what are they doing when they're doing that? I mean, it's this experience of doing something beyond yourself, doing something important in another place with another group of people. This idea of sacrifice, this idea of leadership, of teamwork. This is an experience that Israelis get in the army. It's not a natural experience. You don't get it in school. You don't get it in work. And it's actually very important for entrepreneurship. And this is actually important for Norway as well. And the reason it's important for entrepreneurship is really hard. It's anybody who's going into it has to say to themselves, why am I doing this? There's an easier way to earn a living than being an entrepreneur. You've got to be motivated, I think, by something more than money. In fact, the ones who are kind of the lifestyle entrepreneurs, I think they're going to drop out usually because they're going to hit obstacles along the way. It's going to be difficult. And the ones who are just in it for lifestyle or because they think it's an easy way to earn a living, they're going to drop it. And the ones who are going to make it are the ones who are really passionate about building something that they think is important for them, for their country, for the world. And for that, you have to have the sense of mission, the sense of sacrifice. And that's what Israelis actually pick up in the army, mainly, and also through scouting and all these kind of quasi, preparatory things that relate to, that kind of prepare young Israelis to go in the army, where they're going to need those things. So that's been very important for us. The third factor, so I mentioned the fact that the whole country is a startup, the military experience. The third big factor for us has been that we're a country of immigrants. And that's been really important because, like if you look at Silicon Valley, half the companies there were started by immigrants. Why is that important? Immigrants are natural entrepreneurs because they have those two factors. They were driven enough to move from one country to another. They took a big risk when they did that. So they have those two additional ingredients naturally. So it's not surprising that immigrants in many countries are the entrepreneurs. There's this huge association between immigration and entrepreneurship. And Israel is a country where almost everybody, like I did, I immigrated to Israel 20 years ago from the US. Almost everybody came there themselves or their parents or their grandparents. So it's a country with an immigrant ethos that works very hard at absorbing immigrants, which is an important thing as well. So that's Israeli story. How many minutes do we have in there?
8 minutes.
8 minutes. Okay, so I want to get into, though, kind of how this has become universal and what some of the lessons are from my travels and seeing all these different countries. What I see going on in the world, and this has actually happened since the book came out in the last 5 years, is that, let's say just 5 years ago, there were only really two kind of major startup ecosystems in the world. There's Silicon Valley and the sort of, American satellite thing. And then there was Israel, which startup nation sort of started coming up about 25 years ago in the early 90s. And it's become quite mature and large, not as mature and large as Silicon Valley, but again, second to. And in these past 5 years, startups have been coming up just about everywhere. And this is amazing. I could, tell stories about the different countries that I've been to, and it's, developing countries, it's rich countries. And generally speaking, what I find is everywhere I go, there are startups, and nobody knows that they exist in the country, and nobody knows that they exist outside the country. So they're in what I would call stage one of an ecosystem. Stage one is you've got startups, nobody, and you're just like, hello, we're here. Where's the venture capital? There's no venture capital. and you're not known as an innovation hub that's attracting either local people that set up venture funds or international venture funds to come. So first comes startups, and there's no venture capital. The next stage is you get your first high-profile success stories. Let's say a Skype in Estonia or Angry Birds in Finland. I know that's not the name of the company, but we think of it Angry Birds. In Israel, a classic story that we tell in the book is of a company called ICQ that had a chat program that had millions of users, one of the first programs to go viral over the internet in the 90s, before there really was much of an internet, before Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. Suddenly started going viral. AOL bought this company for $400 million in, I think, 1998, at a time when it had no revenue. So this is a classic bubble story. Don't try this at home. You can't do it anymore. But what happened was Israelis saw this and they said, "Oh wow, look at these guys! They're in their 20s and $400 million. Those idiots can do it. I can do it." And so this is a huge signal inside the country. Entrepreneurship is maybe something I should do. A. B. Outside the country, people said, "Well, AOL bought this thing for some real money. Maybe we ought to check out what's going on in Israel. There's something going on there." So these first high-profile success stories are critical to shining a spotlight on what's already going on and brings the whole system to the next stage. And the next stage is basically just a deepening and maturing of the system, and you start attracting more talent, more capital, venture funds, and so on. And so, Israel is deep into this third stage, and many countries around the world are basically in the first stage. And here's my key message to you, and that is, don't do this alone. The way I think the key to getting to that second and third stage, getting those first high-profile success stories, getting to a place where you're seen as a place where innovation is going on that attracts more, that creates this virtuous cycle. The whole cluster theory of Michael Porter and how Silicon Valley, created this virtual cycle. So you need to get to that critical mass where you start growing. How do you do that? The way you do it is you don't do it by yourself. I mean, maybe 5-10 years ago, we were in a world where you had to do it by yourself. But now, every country is doing this. But we're all doing it by ourselves. I mean, it's crazy, especially in Europe, that you got these mini proto-ecosystems in every country in Europe. I spoke at a conference in Croatia, in Zagreb, called Startup Croatia. And by the way, every country I go has a startup blank name of country, has that kind of organization. And there was full of people, entrepreneurs from different European countries, and some of them were saying, why don't we do this together? Why don't we combine our systems more? And there was a guy there who was running an incubator or accelerator in Estonia. He said in Estonia, most of the accelerators, most of the startups are not from Estonia. And yet most of the Estonian startups, many of them go outside of Estonia to build their startup. So you have this flow going on. And this is, I think, what Norway needs to work on. I'm just guessing here because, I got here a few hours ago. I'm not an expert at all on Norway. But I think it's really something we all need to do. In fact, Israel needs to get much better at this. We need to stop thinking about this is something we need to do by ourselves. We need to combine the strengths and assets of different ecosystems. We need to think, particularly, I think, in the European context, of how do we leverage the fact that we've got, a tremendous diversity of cultures, of strengths, of weaknesses across Europe, people right next to each other. So back to this Croatia thing, I met there a founder of a company called Monolith. The founder was from Croatia. The company was based in the Netherlands. He had founders from Netherlands, founders from Estonia and Croatia. And he said, you know, this is something like the third startup he did and the most successful. And he attributed his success to the fact that he had founders from these three countries, each of which, he wrote me, I asked him, what were the strengths of these different founders? And he could say, well, the people from Netherlands, they were better at this. And people from Estonia, they were better at that. People from Croatia, they were better at that. And that's just how it works. Different people have different strengths. That's why we form teams, when we form startups. Different countries have different strengths. We need to be forming teams across countries. And I think that's a key. And that you have ways here in Norway of playing on that asset, of accelerating that kind of process if you decide that that's what you want to do. So I'm going to leave it at that because I would love to have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singer. Daniel Vidal, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a privilege to be able to join this discussion. First of all, a great presentation of the book. Also, it's a great read. I read the book during the last weeks and really enjoyed the mixture of documentary, storytelling, and history lesson. And actually felt that I learned a lot of new things that I didn't know before. So in my commentary, I will comment both on your book, but also I had a really interesting meeting earlier this year with Mr. Avi Hassan, who's the chief scientist of Israel. And that translates basically that he's kind of a leader of an organization which is like Innovation Norway and the Research Council and Civita, the Industrial Development Corporation of Norway, all in one. So I'll get into the innovation policy side of things as well. While there are many things to learn from Israel's innovation and entrepreneurship policy, there are also many cultural features that can't be copied as easily, which has to do more with history and society than it has to do with politics. And as we all know, culture eats strategy for breakfast and maybe politics for lunch. And also, we should keep in mind that the industrial structure of Norway is quite different from Israel, meaning that typical high-tech and R&D intensive sectors such as ICT, biotech, medtech, which are actually prominently featured in the economy of Israel, are not as important to the Norwegian economy yet. And because we have a great contribution from oil and gas, maritime and fishing, and more resource-based industries. But there are also some similarities. One thing that I actually didn't know or had not reflected upon before reading the book is that when the wall came down in Israel, or in the world, or in Europe actually, a lot of the Russian Jews moved to Israel. There was a huge immigration, and these Russians were, a large number of them were really well educated, and people like engineers or doctors or scientists. So all of a sudden you had this kind of problem that you had to absorb all these people who had great skills into an economy which was not really at that moment a startup nation like today. So the first thing they did in Israel was that they opened up tech transfer offices and incubators and all these things, but it didn't really work at first because they just sat there with ideas and they tried to develop new products, new innovations, but there was no ecosystem surrounding it to build up and actually take things to market. Therefore, I will focus on what they did, which I think is really relevant and interesting in the Norwegian context. So the kind of analysis that was made by the financial Ministry of Finance in Israel was that they lacked venture capital. And also they lacked kind of the business skills needed to take this globally from day one, like you said. So they implemented a scheme which is called the YOSMA program. Probably not pronouncing that right, but it means initiative in Hebrew. It says in the book. So what they did, they kind of constructed this in a very clever way because they wanted to get influx of international capital, and mainly American capital, I would guess. So they had to have a partner from Israeli bank or institutional capital. They had to have kind of Israeli venture capital actors in the learning, basically, and also they had to have an international partner. In that way, they secured that they would learn how to kind of build up this venture capital industry and also attract foreign capital. And the lesson from the JOSMA investment program, which was implemented in the early 90s, is that a substantial public investment made at the right time in a fertile environment actually can spark a self-sustained and private venture capital industry. The initial investment of $100 million made in 10 venture capital funds between 92 and 97 by the Israeli government was matched by private capital. But the real allure of the scheme was the potential upside for investors built into this program. So each fund contained an option for buying out the state share after 5 years at a good price, given that this was a success. But there was little downside for the government, since all initial costs were paid back plus interest rates. So the state, didn't get rich from this, but they didn't lose money, and they also kind of gave the impulse of starting up a new financial industry, which was had expertise in investing in the early phases in innovative companies. And what happened was that all 10 funds were subsequently bought by private investors who since then have continued to invest. But the difference is that the original 10 JOSMA funds now manage $3 billion. So 100 million, I mean, it's like 30-fold increase in scope and impact. So this, of course, is to the benefit of hundreds of Israeli tech companies every year. But the real winner is probably the Israeli society, which has restructured its economy in a more knowledge-intensive direction. It has increased the tax base, and it has created hundreds of thousands of jobs in knowledge-intensive and born global companies, which is which is really fascinating. I mean, actually, Israel is the country in the world outside of the States with the highest number of companies on the Nasdaq technology stock market, which is like, should not be possible, but it is.
China has more, but we're a little smaller than China.
Yeah, okay. Good. So the JOSMA scheme actually kickstarted the Israeli venture capital industry, which today is a world leader in itself. So what is the lesson for Norway here? I mean, given that Norway has a well-functioning venture capital industry in the late stage, both on the private and the public side, but seriously lack competent private capital in the early stage, we should learn from the design of the JOSMA scheme and implement a scheme specifically aimed at the phase after the public grants from Innovation Norway, but before the seed funds and private venture capital industry, I would say roughly in the interval between 1 and 15 million NOK. And also, there are other things to learn. As I mentioned, I had a meeting with Avi Hassan from the Office of the Chief Scientist. It's a public body. And as I said, they have basically the responsibility for the ecosystem, innovation, R&D in Israel, except for not basic research. They run the incubator programs, the tech transfer offices, and all these things, all the programs for them. And his background was interesting as well, because he, of course, was a venture capitalist as well. And he was very clear on a number of things, and among them that his mission as a chief scientist was to push the ecosystem for innovation always further, test the limits. And he specifically emphasized the need for experimenting with policy initiatives continuously, and then quickly learn and reiterate, much as a startup would do, actually. And he actually, referred to that in our meeting, that they kind of throw out new ideas, they try them, and then, okay, it works, tweak a little bit, and push some more money in that direction. So it's an interesting way for a public body to work as well, I think. In order to do so, the OCS always works very closely with the private sector, and having a tight and effective partnership with the private sector is seen as a catalyst that creates far stronger impact than what the chief scientist and his office can manage alone. Also, they always place really tough demands on performance on all private organizations that they cooperate with, such as incubators, tech transfer offices, and early stage fund managers. He was also quite clear on that once demands have been met, they monitor performance and give long-term funding and significant funding to incubators and others, so they can focus on building great companies instead of chasing money most of the time. This is also an important lesson for Norway, which in the past has done the opposite. Weak funding combined with short-term programs without proper performance indicators. And all that, hopefully, is about to change when it comes to investing slightly more in top performing incubators, even though funding per top incubator is nowhere near the 15 to 20 million NOK put into each top Israeli incubators. So they really have a different kind of framework to work within. And by the way, the cash goes to the entrepreneurs, not the incubators. The incubator managers and partners create value for themselves by owning parts of the incubator companies. So lesson 2 for incubation specifically, invest substantial amounts over the long term, monitor performance, kick out the ones that don't deliver, and let the incubators decide for themselves which profit model to operate with. And I also have a few other lessons. They are actually not my own, but I got some great insights from emailing a bit with Rotem Schnoor, which is sitting over there. He's an Israeli professor working here in Norway with entrepreneurship at the University of Agder. And his comments to what Norway could learn from Israel is really interesting as well. He thinks that we should create formal incentive mechanisms for global companies to set up R&D centers in Norway, much more actively than we do today. I mean, we have examples of that already today, but we should do it more actively. And the reason for that is that working in those types of companies is like a training ground for entrepreneurs that can leave those companies later, maybe work with them as the first customers and all these things. The other thing he said is that we should relax employment laws for young companies to lower their initial costs. And also, in line with what Mr. Hassan said, tightening the collaboration between Innovation Norway, the Research Council, the industry players, and entrepreneurs. Also, he recommends to step up efforts on the cultural side, such as Oslo Innovation Week, where we are today, spreading positive media attention to the role model that entrepreneurs can play in renewing and improving society. So, to wrap up, I think that Norwegian innovation policy should be much more bold and ambitious, and also more in tune with the private sector. Having said that, the government should also monitor the performance delivered by these cooperating private organizations, whether they are research institute, incubators, TTOs, or early stage funds. And they should ramp up the money to the ones that deliver. So, if we never challenge one another and reward quality, we will have a really hard time developing ourselves at the pace needed in the global innovation race. And on that happy note, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel Vidal. Anita Tosse, please, the floor is yours.
Coming to Norway and sharing the valuable key lessons learned from your book. And
I don't think it's on. Is it? I'm mute on. Just let me check.
Some things.
Yes, now it's on.
It's a girl. It's okay. I just wanted to say thank you for coming to Norway and share the story with us, because I want to share with you the 3 key ways that we take from your book. And then I want to reflect before we do that. But the obvious 3 key takeaways is that there is more to innovation than cash. The dialogue and the topic in Norway is a lot about, as long as we get more money, we'll fix it. I think that's a key issue for us. Secondly, culture is key. How you describe failure, how you just don't talk about failure, but you actually accept failure. Culture is not only king, culture is queen, culture is everything. It eats everything for breakfast. Number 2, key takeaway 3, the ability to not only build networks, but capitalize on networks, opening up for foreign investments. We are afraid of foreign money. We are afraid of having international investment into our companies. When our startups are being sold, it's a disaster for Norway. It's a failure. So it's a culture thing. And then part of the culture part is also the brand. So what is the brand of the Israeli nation? The startup nation. what is the brand of Norway? So it's the self-esteem on our ability to actually be successful in startups. So these are the 3 key takeaways from reading your book. But first, I just want to share some high-level reflections. Israel is a very interesting case for the Norwegian innovation policy development. So the 2 countries has a lot in common, while at the same time we're having very different innovation systems. So yes, we're comparable of size. We're also comparable of that our economies are productive, meaning we are producing together a lot of wealth. So from an economic point of view, both countries must be considered success stories. And also both represent small markets that need to export a lot in order to pay for our welfare expenses. But again, I think it's a fair guess that the success in both cases are caused by an advanced ability to develop relevant competencies, either though it's different. But when you read the research and innovation statistic, this is not immediately apparent because the EU Commission has an overall objective for Europe to invest 3% of GDP, and I think we should challenge that too, in research and development. And the Norwegian government also has this as a goal. And again, I think we should challenge that. At the moment, Norway invests 1.65% of GDP in R&D, below the EU and OECD averages. But the corresponding number for Israel is 4.4. And according to the statistics of the figure in 2007, it was a mind-blowing 4.8%. These numbers do not tell the whole story, however. These statistics are designed in such a way that they give more weight to research-based innovations activities and so-called high-tech industries. High-tech industries consist of companies that invest much in R&D as a percentage of the total turnover. And Israel has a lot of research-intensive high-tech companies. Norway has an industrial structure dominated by natural resources and industries that invest less in R&D, regardless of where they are in the world. We innovate by other means. So Statoil is considered in this as a low-tech company. Statoil is not a low-tech company, right? So indeed, we have found that the Norwegian industry is also knowledge intensive. Like Israel, we have a highly educated workforce with a great ability to adapt to changing framework conditions. Therefore, the Global Innovation Index put Norway and Israel side by side, number 14 and 15. So I think that Norway and Israel clearly demonstrate that there are more than one road to wealth creation. Norway is also built on a culture that values learning and knowledge. The tradition goes all the way back to the Reformation in the 16th century, when the kings decided that the welfare of the country depended on the country's ability to satisfy God. The Danes and the Norwegians were to become exemplary Christians, and for that to happen, they had to be able to read the gospel. An unintended consequence of this policy was that the Union produced a large number of people who had learned how to learn and were therefore able to thrive under changing conditions. A large number of Norwegian sailors became captains in the Dutch fleet because they know how to read. A similar, but in no way identical, development is found in the Jewish history. Jewish mystics also valued reading and learning. And the Kabbalists believed this learning was essential if they were to serve God and in that way save the world. The stereotype of the intellectual Jew has some root in reality. In Europe, the Jews were normally excluded from farming the land. The alternatives were often trade and thinking. So the lack of natural resources combined with a strong learning culture made a high-tech strategy a sensible strategy for Israel. There is therefore a strong focus on research-intensive manufacturing. The excess of natural resources combined with a strong learning culture led Norway into the opposite direction. We needed to develop the advanced competencies needed to harvest and develop natural resources like petroleum and fish. But these industries do not have to be high-tech in the Israeli sense of the word. And I just want to quote you before I come to my 3 points. In your book, you write that the Israeli success must be something broader and deeper. You say, it must lie in the stories of individual entrepreneurs like Shai Agassi, which are emblematic of the state itself. As we will show, it is a story not just of talent, but of tenacity, of insatiable questioning, of authority, of determined informality, combined with a unique attitude towards failure, teamwork, mission, risk, and cross-disciplinary activity. So the 3 things, more than cash. You have been very generous when it comes to funding schemes, but you also providing that there is more to a well-functioning ecosystem than cash. And you refer to the Josh learners setting the table. I completely agree. It's more than cash. And also in Norway, we do have seed capital funds, but we're talking more about the funds than actually the results of the funds. So how many of you can mention companies growing up being well familiar from the first funds? Because the focus we have is we want more money to have new funds. And we don't even remember the startups. While you are nurturing, you having focus on the entrepreneurs and the companies coming out of the funds. We have very concerned in Norway about we want the funds to be very high. Your funds are lower. You have a fund which is lower than $50 million. We have a lot higher funds than that. So I think the focus of funds is challenging. Also, you are referring to Josmas, main of attracting foreign venture capitalists. We're afraid of foreign capital, aren't we? No? We shouldn't be, but I'm talking about the elephant in the room. I don't know. Culture is king. Being small and aiming big. We are similar in size and we can learn from your mindset. We are 5 million people. We need to do as Israel. We need to take what differentiates us from the other countries and really be strong building on that. Yesterday we had the president of India here. It's obvious that the Indian market is interesting for Norway. It's not that obvious for India how interesting Norway is to help them becoming #1 economic country of the world in 2050. We need to be extremely clear on who we are, how we can make a difference, and how we can make India do that turnover. Then we need to agree on how we need to build our national brand. Secondly, team spirit. You say it's okay to fail. You say in Israel, to do a startup rather than becoming a doctor is more popular, even though the risk is higher. And then the third thing, culture. You say, you talk about the culture core. I think that's extremely interesting in your book. You said, the culture core that other countries are missing. A culture core is built on a rich stew of aggressiveness and team orientation, on isolation and connectedness, and on being small and aiming big. And I think that is key for us. We need to do the same. And the third one, established links. Your relationship to the United States, I think, is under-evaluated. I think how you capitalize on your networks, how you have become this extrovert country. If you compare, Norway have lots of ideas, but maybe we have more ideas than Israel, but you're better in taking it out, so you're more an extrovert country than Norway. So I think that was my time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. We will very shortly open up for Q&As and comments, but I want to start with the question, and while I ask the questions and the panelists answer, I will look around and also notice people coming on the speakers list. I mean, you all kept talking about culture. this term culture. And Saul Singer, if you were to reflect upon how do you promote a virtuous culture, is there something politicians can do, society can do? How do you get a virtuous culture?
So I of course completely agree that culture is key, that culture is king and queen and so on. And but I think when people hear that, they think, well, we need to have a culture that accepts risk-taking. We need to have a culture, you know, that makes us more determined or whatever, more open and all. And that's very intimidating because nobody's got a culture like that. Nobody, I mean, you know, every country I go to thinks, here we don't like to take risks. And actually, in Israel too, most people don't like to take risks. Even entrepreneurs don't like to take risks. The difference between entrepreneurs and everybody else is not that they like to take risks. These are not like a group of bungee jumpers, and you know, they're not. Some of them may be into extreme sports. I don't know, but it's not so much that they like to take risk. It's that they care so much. They believe so much in what they're trying to do. They're so driven to accomplish the mission that they've set out for themselves, that they're willing to take risk, they overcome their dislike of risk in order to be entrepreneurs. Now, again, those kind of people are few and far between, but that's true in every country, including in Israel. The majority of people aren't entrepreneurs. It's always, and this is great news, is that it's always a small minority that's the entrepreneurs. And you don't have to change the entire culture in order to have, to nurture that kind of subculture. And this is the way I would put it, is Israel is very unusual because we're such a small country that our kind of mainstream culture is this kind of accepting of risk and mission and all that. But in most other places, take the United States, Silicon Valley has a different culture than the rest of America. It's a subculture. It's a subculture where it's more okay to take risk, where there's certain norms that are built around entrepreneurship are more normal and acceptable than they are, say, in Pittsburgh or Cincinnati. Now, so everywhere that develops an innovation ecosystem is going to develop a subculture somewhere, and usually it's a part of town. And I'm sorry to say this for people involved in tech parks. Usually it's not in tech parks. Usually it's in a part of town, which kind of cool part of town with maybe lower rents and better restaurants and a lot of creative energy. Because startups like to be where there's creative energy. And creative energy tends to be in the coolest neighborhood in town. So that's where you're going to have startups coming up organically. And one of the things I think that governments can do is, first of all, anywhere that's happening already, just if that's happening, you're golden. That's what you're aiming for. And you just want to, like, a nice lesson is from London. They've, I'm sure, built their share of tech parks, but they also had, you know, startups coming up around a place that's now called Silicon Roundabout, somewhere between the center of town and the Olympic Park. Not a very nice part of town, but that's where the startups wanted to be. So they started coming up there. So what London did is they sort of drew a circle around that. They called that Tech City. So instead of building another tech park, they basically just highlighted, show a spotlight on where startups were coming up. I thought that was a very smart thing to do. And I completely agree with that it's not about money per se. But the fact that you have money is actually, there are creative ways to spend money. That's a fraction of what you're spending that I think could be very productive. Like, look at, again, what is the goal here? I think the goal is to get the flow going, to get Norwegians out the door, to get other people into Norway to do startups. That kind of flow that internationalizes your system. So how do you do that? I mean, like Chile has this thing called Startup Chile, where they're paying people $40,000. They're giving startup teams $40,000 to just come and work in Chile and do their startup in Chile. And it's actually captured people. Imagine a lot of people in the startup world know about this. And it's helped a lot with their branding and basically saying, we're open for business. We want startups. Norway could do something like that. You got a lot more money than Chile does. And it's not large amounts of money. And just one last comment on the YOSMA model. The key thing there is that governments are terrible at venture capital. The brilliance of that YOSMA program, which, by the way, the Israeli government did a lot of stupid things you don't hear about, but that particular program was very effective, and it's good we don't won that. It's very effective, but the beauty of it was that the government succeeded in attracting private venture funds, and then the private funds bought out the government position and became completely private. And that's the goal, because even private venture funds are lousy at VC. Most VCs don't do very well. That's private VCs. Government's even worse at it. So you want the system, the VC system, to basically be private. So the government is just acting as a catalyst to kind of deal with the sort of market failure where in the beginning, and you want it to be completely private. But I agree. Even the problem is not lack of venture capital in the world. There's an overall glut of investment money, whether it's venture capital, angels, now crowdfunding. What there's a shortage of is great startups, and so the more you kind of internationalize your system and work with other ecosystems, either up-and-coming ecosystems or with Israel, like the example from India is a great example. I mean, I just want to say, I learned a tiny bit about Norway, about this concept of, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but the laws of Jenta.
Janteloven.
How do you say it?
Oh, did you already learn that?
Yes, I work quickly. What's it called?
Janteloven.
Janta.
Janta. You should not learn this word.
I'm not going to. So this is a great example. This is a very strong cultural trait, okay? And you could say, oh, this is lousy for entrepreneurship. It means, we don't like to stick out. We don't like to be too successful. And this is really terrible for entrepreneurship. But every cultural trait has its advantages and disadvantages. And for example, that kind of trait is a powerful trait for most. In a lot of countries, you don't have that kind of thing. You don't have anything that points to community, anything that points to in this balance between individualism and society, that having an extreme in one way or another is actually a cultural asset. But what that means is you can turn that to your advantage. Your ambition is not to make money. It's not to have this big house. It's not to stick out. What it is to change the world. I mean, you can take that value and you can turn it into, our ambition is to take our technology, our knowledge from oil and gas, our great universities, our money, and combine with the great problems of the world and the entrepreneurs that are trying to solve those great problems, and bring what we have to the table to help them in India, in other places. So you can see how any strong cultural trait can be turned from a so-called liability to an asset.
I want to, obviously it's a huge challenge for a moderator to interrupt when you say so much interesting things, but of course you have to limit your remarks going on further. But Daniel, Mr. Singer mentioned that we have money, but do we spend them wisely?
Well, I don't think. I mean, I think we have a lot of money floating around in the innovation system. Innovation Norway, the Research Council now spend money, and a lot of that money is well spent in the right places, I think. But when it comes to venture capital, I don't think we have a really wise spending pattern, because we spend most of our, the heavy money, like you say, we have heavy funds, but they're mostly spent in the the later stages, where they kind of tend to crowd out the private capital, and they don't actually do as much good. I mean, they just try to pick the winners at a later stage instead of kind of boosting the kind of underground of startups that should come. So we have a problem with the flow of new startups of good quality that are taken from a really early stage and then over to the private VC. So that's my view on it. And so I think we should kind of change the pattern a little bit and just make sure that we fill up the gap in the kind of middle phase in between grants from Innovation Norway, for example, and the private VC industry. But I just wanted to comment on Janteloven, because it's funny, because it's like you say, it could be also a strength in one way, because I've been to many like investment presentations of Nordic and Norwegian companies, and because we are kind of quiet people, we don't like to stick out and all that, but that also means that usually when you go out and present something, a product or a service or an innovation that you have made, you have put a lot of emphasis that this is good quality. So you don't present bullshit. You present something that is good, and then you kind of under-communicate how good it is. So, some of these investment presentations, the international investors, they ask, why do you only ask for like 5 million? Come on, this is super great innovation. You should have 100 million, So this could also be turned into a strength. And I think that if you look at, again, venture capital exits, the Nordics actually account for 27% of the successful exits made in the last 5 years, which is, really punching above our weights as a Nordic region. So, and I think that has something to do with it. I mean, the guy who sold Minecraft a couple of weeks ago for $2.5 billion, he said, "Oh no, it's got too big. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go back and be a nerd." So I mean, those things can also be turned into a strength. Yeah.
Anita told us that you recently started as CEO for Innovation Norway. What do you see as your main challenge in making sure a culture is virtuous and prosperous?
Do we have the whole day? Or
like in 90 seconds or 120 seconds?
No, I think I'm very inspired by the startup book, and I mean, Innovation Norway has a part of delivering our part of the value chain here, specifically when it comes to the brand of the country, and also on the startup side. We just got there's a state budget, and Innovation Norway, we have entrepreneurship scholarship. It was just increased by 110 million. And this is actually to work on what you said. You said we need to create more successful entrepreneurs, making the culture for actually making them, we're giving them some money and then they can test their ideas so that before it becomes venture ready, we need to have a culture where there are more entrepreneurs that can test their ideas on an early stage. So definitely that was a good message from the government, from our side. But I think when it comes to Janteloven, what the brand we have on startup, the culture we have in sports, our ability to mobilize our nation on sports, it's enormous. You would not believe it. How many sport experts we have, and look at the few people. What are the possibilities for us to win all these Olympic gold medals?
Actually, when you look at where do mission-oriented people come from? In Israel, the military has been very good at kind of telling people what a mission is and making them mission-oriented. So it's really important for startups. But when you think about it, actually, sports is another area. Athletes are very mission-oriented. Yes. They're very clear what they're trying to do. They work very hard to get there. they're very mission oriented, and it's actually professional athletes after they're professional athletes. A lot of them do go into business, become entrepreneurs, and quite successfully. So that kind of mission orientation they get from sports is an important asset.
And that's just the point of what we need to do at the innovation side. Also, like he says, make sure we get the role models up. Make sure that we get the entrepreneurs up, the stories, that we actually learn the benefit of the companies that we have invested in. We need to make the national media be more interested in writing these cases, because if there's a case about an entrepreneur, or Innovation Norway, it's how many money did we lose? How many risk projects did we have? Did we spend the money right? I mean, we're measuring our virkemidler before they actually have the time to work. You know,
right?
So I think an important role of Innovation Norway is to drive that motivation and show off our success stories, because we are on stage one in your ecosystem. We do have startups, but our focus nationally is not on the startups, because that's individualistic and they make money, and we need to change that, right?
Right. So you definitely need like a Minecraft or a Skype or something like that. That's the
we're kind of halfly proud of it. Proud of it. If it's research based, it's okay. If it's not research based, it's from a garage or something.
Right.
It's halfly.
But what if, look, Minecraft actually? I just read a very interesting article about how much kids are learning from games like Minecraft, and that when you actually, that the whole gaming ecosystem, that kids who are, say 8 years old, are actually reading materials in order to help them play the games. They are reading stuff at a much higher level than their grade level, because they're so motivated to learn more about how to play this game. So that this is actually, so that even something like Minecraft actually has a lot of interesting kind of social importance to it. But what I'm saying is that Norway can have success stories that are about solving global problems.
Yes.
And this is something that's okay to stand up with. It's okay to be successful with. You need to find a way to be that makes it okay to be successful, and that's a very good way to do it. And in fact, I think most great success stories have an important social element one way or another. They're fulfilling a human need. I mean, there are exceptions, like gambling and porn and stuff like that, where they're successful and it's not great social impact. But most things, whether it's a social network or a game or whatever it is, there's an important aspect of changing the world for the better, and that's something you can stick out at. You should be proud to stick up for those things.
I want to bring in Daniel 30 seconds and then move on to the audience. We move quickly towards 9:30. So
yeah, just a short comment on the allegory with sports, because I think it's a really good one. Because sports, what you do is train, and it's a performance-based thing. You just, the joy of building something is what matters, not the final result. After you sold your company, you say goodbye, but it's like playing with Lego. It's no fun afterwards when it's finished. It's like the process of doing it is the good fun. So and I also think that gaming is a really kind of good allegory, like you say, because you're so motivated by the result, so you spend many hours to perform the act of doing this, and then you might eventually learn how to program yourself. So I think we should look at the entrepreneurship as a performance-based thing, not like a result-based thing. Like, it's not like looking at a picture; it's the process.
I noticed 6 people wanting to come on the speakers list. Just to be sure that and there's also 7. I hope I'll get time for everybody, but I can't guarantee it. But just to make sure that I haven't ignored anyone. First is Jørn, and then Pia, and then I noticed you sitting there, and you, and you, and you. So we start with, we had a couple of more there. I tried to notice, but we take 3 questions at a time. So please just note, and I'll get the floor afterwards. Jan, please.
Jan, I'm managing director of the Oslo International Hub. It's the hub in Norway that's only focused on international, now with 72 startup companies. We know this really seen well. We have Tel Aviv hub is a partner of ours. I'll give you a real-life story from Norway. This is a private innovation hub, not a single penny public money has been spent. Last month, we have gone through all Norwegian public funding systems, and we found exactly 0 krona support for innovation systems like the hub, unless you're based outside of Oslo, of course. Now, I think it would be wise to spend money, public money, on innovation systems also in Oslo. Recommendation from us, we have tried it, we've done it, recommendation, real life. To use the Singer, 1 year ago, I started using the phrase Silicon Fjord. Many have since started using this phrase about the tech environment in Norway, because it is actually blossoming and blooming like crazy here. Now, I would like to invite you, when you go on your tour, next time to Mongolia, if I got it right, to start using that term about Norway. Now, fjords are internationally well known. Silicon is a good word, and there is a lot of tech startups here. Of course, I would also like to invite everybody else.
You have to finish now because we're running out of time.
Thank you.
Okay, so one of the questions I understood was directed certainly towards Anita, and that is the typical criticism that Innovation Norway is too concerned about the districts and less of Oslo. You can comment on that afterwards. And you, please stand up and present yourself.
Pia is a political scientist. I have worked for the government for many years, especially on security. I was advisor for the chief of defense for several years, and a member of the Conservative Party. To me, it was a great day when I walked up to the Nobel Institute to listen to President Perry's 13th May this year, and our parade street, Karl Johan, was decorated by Stars of David, together with the Blue Cross of St. Paula. It was really hard for me. I think that our problem in Norway is that finding oil in the 60s made us rich enough to afford mediocrity. Rich enough to afford mediocrity. And that has been cursed ever since. As King Harald said in his speech when
I think we have to end there, and I take that with oil dependency and mediocrity, and I'll let the panelists comment on it, and then we move on to the lady there.
My name is Eva Ferral, and at the end of this, I was lucky to visit your incubator in Tel Aviv together with the Norwegian delegation, and we've seen what you have done. Then we have had for many years Norwegian industry attaché in San Francisco. In other words, we have in fact had the information or the contacts with this environment. But at that time, I think we still didn't need to do that. We do some, but we didn't need to do so much innovation. Now we really do, and we are looking forward to the environmental area to transfer the oil and industry competence to the environment. Could you comment on what are you doing on this in this piece?
So I understood the last question to be about the transformation to a green economy. Certainly there are a need for a lot of innovations and a lot of opportunities. If I start with you, Anita Tose, the typical question or criticism that Innovation Norway has gotten, that you're too concerned with districts and too less of Oslo, and where the big startup companies are said to be more, have a bigger chance.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the key areas that we have a job to do on communication, because this is a myth. Take, for example, we have 300 millions in 2015 for startup scholarships. Of those 300 millions, 230 of those are national. So, you know, this is our job to communicate and be very clear on keeping alive those myths that's been floating around. And Vincent, my colleague here, he has defined 10 myths that we're soon going to introduce to you in a humorous way. Mm-hmm. So what's fact or not, to make sure that we communicate better. But I have to agree, because if you go to our website, you know, and you try to find our people, they are divided into districts. So there are signal effects on how we communicate that really that makes this myth become a truth, but it's not. So we will change that. We have a job to do that. Yeah.
Daniel Vidal, oil dependency, oil curse. Is the oil money in Norway actually a problem for innovations as you see it?
No, I don't really agree on that, because I think, how you handle a natural resource of such, magnitude as oil has to do with the institutions you have as a society. Therefore, you always see like a country like Venezuela or Nigeria have trouble because they have kind of kleptocratic governments that think about how can they enrich themselves. And coming into like a society like Norway, we had better institutions, more democratic governance. So we don't. I don't see it as a problem. What is the problem is more that since it becomes so huge, a lot of the industry has been focused in that direction because it's profitable. I think we should think of it as a possibility, like how can we use all that high competence that is in the oil industry to, transform other sectors like clean tech or health or med tech, So it's not a problem to have smart people working to solve complex problems. The opposite is true.
30 seconds, Anita Tåseth, before I move on.
Comment. I completely agree on this, because we have a way where we can differentiate if we allow ourselves the things that we believe that we can change the world. We can actually do that with some of our core competencies that we have gained the past 40 years. For example, in India, with our engineers, with our R&D, when it comes to help the water situation. I mean, we have lots of unique assets. But then again, we need to go forward on and sell Norway on how we can be unique, and we can do that in a different way. Not only making those fancy startups, Skypes, but aim even higher to change the world on a high level.
Right.
But that's a big culture thing in Norway, to discuss stuff like this.
Mr. Singer, the question was about the green energy and the transformation. Of course, this is a big issue in the world. If you were to reflect on 90 to 120 seconds about what are the opportunities for innovators going forward to the green economy?
Well, the green economy is just one massive area of innovation in terms of solving global problems, and I totally agree that a lot of the technologies you're developing here for an energy sector are applicable for things in environmental problems. But I want to throw out a kind of a radical idea in terms of what was said here before about the international hub. Right? What if you took a small fraction of the budget and said, we're going to pay for half the plane ticket of Norwegian entrepreneurs who want to go to other countries and do startups there, or go to conferences, and vice versa, to bring other people to do startups in Norway. We'll give you, we'll pay part of your plane ticket. We'll give you a grant, a scholarship, whatever. We're going to start throwing money at that to internationalize our system. And again, the amounts of money would be tiny compared to what you're spending, but the bang for the buck both in terms of what good it would do, but also the branding, what it would signal that Norway is opening the doors. Norway wants to be international. Norway really is serious about innovation, about connecting with the rest of the world and solving global problems with its great technology, its great science, its great entrepreneurs. And they're even putting money into it. They're even subsidizing in a big way and packaging it and all that. I mean, and you can have contests to do this, contests to come to Norway, contests to go out. This kind of flow you can stimulate with, a little creativity and a little bit of money. And the signal that this would send would be tremendous, I think. And it would really help break down this idea that, you have to do everything yourselves, or we're not enough connected to the world. And by the way, this is a lot of the problem entrepreneurs have generally, and this is a problem in Israel, is they don't see enough problems. I mean, entrepreneurs can only solve the problems that they see. We don't get out the door enough. If Israelis were to come to Norway they would see things going on here, issues in your oil and gas sector, whatever, that they didn't understand. Your industries, your big industries, are actually an asset in this, because all these big companies, they have a list of about 100 big problems they'd like to solve. They don't know how to solve them. And the entrepreneurs have no idea what those problems are. There's not enough conversation between the corporates and the startups, but also our entrepreneurs don't expose themselves enough to big problems in other countries. And that's why this flow is so important.
We are running out of time very quickly, so I'm going to go to the audience one last time, and I will start with the lady sitting there, and after your time.
Hi, my name is Anne. I'm a startupper, and I'm in the program of the Oslo International Director Program. So nice to see you here.
Very quickly now, where?
We're talking about the similarities between Israel and Norway, and one of the similarities that they are not being commented on is the immigration. When they have the Russian immigration to Israel with all the doctors and professionals, and here in Oslo you have the same situation. You have a lot of immigration, and you have a lot of professionals who don't get work because they are foreign and who wants to start up. And I'm missing comments on that area about the international.
So the question is about immigration. Maybe what Norway can learn from Israel to bring in immigrants in the innovation system.
The ones that are here,
Yeah, the ones who are here. How to bring them in and to be part of a solution.
Thank you for a great presentation and discussion. I'm Anne Falvik from the Research Council, heading up the innovation activities there. In Norway now, we're kind of in a Nobel and Fora because we got 2 Nobel Prizes, or 1 Nobel Prize in medicine recently. Israel is a great startup nation, but also a great science nation. I think you have close to 40 Nobel Prizes. Can you comment about the flow, connection, interactions between the science system, the big brains, and the startup community?
So the comment is about the science and innovation, the connection, and you sit there.
Hi, my name is Hans Christian Bjørn, and I come from Nordic Innovation, under the Nordic Council of Ministers. I just want to thank you for great perspectives, and my main takeaway is the internationalization of the innovation ecosystem. And we're just in the midst of writing a strategy for how the Nordic 5 countries can cooperate to accelerate entrepreneurship. That's my question to you. And you mentioned part of it, with these plane tickets, etc. And we now have Innovation Norway set up an innovation house in the Silicon Valley, which has now been expanded to be Nordic, because we know that critical mass, greater deal flow, we get louder. What are the single most important things you think we should focus on? Because we're not born in a bad neighborhood. We have good neighbors. We can do things together.
So what is the most important thing to focus on? The last was one people from in the behind. Yes.
Yeah, hi, my name is Guardian. I'm investor and entrepreneur from Europe.
Speak up, please.
Yeah, very simple question about Israel that I don't know actually. The narrative of Silicon Valley is that an entrepreneur is not really regarded as a good entrepreneur until he's failed a couple of times. How is that in Israel? I mean, do you have serial entrepreneurs that are failing a lot, and are they eventually succeeding?
The question is about the need to fail and how this is regarded in Israel, or as you said, that in Silicon Valley, entrepreneur is not considered a good entrepreneur before he has failed. So I think we're going to wrap up. You can give the comments you would like, and start in the opposite direction. So I start with you, Anita.
Yeah, I just got a very concrete suggestion from Singer.
Yes, sure. Comment on that.
So I showed him the 6 different programs that we have on global entrepreneurship. And he said, well, why don't you open your tech in Israel, your Think program? And I think we're going to go back and discuss that. So, yeah.
And Daniel?
I just want to comment on one thing. The question from the girl from the Oslo International Hub, I think, I mean, like having like an entrepreneurship visa or something, I think would be a really good idea. Also like a signal effect, because visa is about law, gets a lot of positive attention, because it's the fact that people who immigrate to Norway from other countries, if they have, you know, education backgrounds and stuff, it's really difficult. I mean, at least that's what you read in the press, to kind of translate your competencies into the kind of Norwegian education system and stuff. But a lot of these people, like you say, I mean, my father was an immigrant, and so am I, actually, to this country from our neighbors in the east. And immigrants are always, you know, they've taken that choice, so they're probably they have a higher kind of likelihood to be able to want to start up and to actually, you know, start to build something in that new place they come to. So I think we should use that and think about stuff like immigration visa for immigrants.
Last comment, Mr. Singer. It was mentioned here that there are a lot of scientists who get Nobel prizes from Israel. Or some also get Nobel Peace Prize. But the connection between science and innovation, it seems pretty obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah, so a lot of great comments here. I mean, certainly a big part of the story of Startup Nation is you know, any innovation ecosystem kind of starts with you know, great universities. If you look at Silicon Valley, it was Stanford was a key component of that cluster. For us, we have, you know, 4 of our universities together, you could say, are Stanford, that were an important part of this story. And we have a pretty well-developed tech transfer system around these universities and also around our hospitals even. Even the hospitals have their own kind of tech transfer offices, and you know, this obviously, you know, the science and research institutions are huge sources of innovation if you could just bridge the cultural gap between academia and business and entrepreneurship, and it's a cultural challenge. It can be overcome. You can encourage people to commercialize. You can help them. You can structure it in a way that makes it works. And actually, a lot of countries have been sending groups to Israel to look at our tech transfer system, kind of as a way of how do you structure this. So that's worth doing. What was said before about the international. About how you're sending them essentially a regional hub. Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I'm talking about, is that, and you can just take that and kind of expand that, because it shouldn't just be Nordics, it should also be Europe, and it also be with other countries, certainly with Israel, but even farther beyond. And that's the kind of thing that needs to be expanded, and it's building on this idea of, let's pool our strengths. Let's combine our strengths. Let's take advantage of our cultural diversity, of our different strengths, and get a critical mass together, rather than trying to do it all by yourself. Failure. Talking about failure. About someone saying, yes. One of the most obvious thing that makes a startup ecosystem, whether it's Silicon Valley or Israel, is an attitude towards failure that basically says that failure is part of success. Basically, like when I was in Chile, they were just getting around to changing their law, which basically made it to be it was illegal to be bankrupt, to go bankrupt, and they were getting rid of that, saying, okay, it's legal to be bankrupt. I said, this is a great idea. Thank God you're doing this, because if you ban bankruptcy, you're banning failure. And if you ban failure, you're banning success. You cannot do startups if you can't fail. You've got to be able to fail. And most startups, most entrepreneurs have failed a number of times along the way. You can almost 100%. Even the success stories, the ones that look like they had this instant success, I can guarantee you that they had a bunch of failures within that startup, where they started with one idea, it didn't work, started another one. A startup is basically an experimental process looking for a sustainable, repeatable, scalable business model. It's a search. That's what a startup is. A startup is a search for a successful business model. A big company is the scaling up of a proven business model. Those are the two kind of beasts we have in the economy, the search for the business model and the scaling up of that model. And they're two different animals, and we need both in our system. But for the startup animal to work, you've got to be able to fail, to experiment, to fail in a very quick as possible way, this whole lean startup system. And this has become typical of startup ecosystems everywhere.
Before we give a big applause to the panelists, let me give a few messages. I will end in 45 seconds. At the end there, we had a Civita report called Kompetent Kapital, who has some good advices on how to promote innovation in Norway. We also give out the Entrepreneurs Build Norway, as Herman mentioned. Check out civita.no and our newsletter. Check also out the Oslo Innovation Week. There are a lot of great events happening this week. And one final thing, it's maybe the best known innovation from Norway, the cheese slicer. It's a special gift for you, Mr. Singer. Some books for our other panelists. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the panel.